And so I think there's so many systems like that are just like, we'll make the decision, you just fit yourself into the box. And queerness kind of pulls you out of that, and it makes you start questioning other structures too.
Welcome to the Coffeeshop AU. I'm Jay, your host. I am trans, non-binary, neurodivergent, and I currently live in Seoul, Korea. My pronouns are they, them, and I believe that queer folks like me deserve more safe spaces to tell our stories our way. And to do just that, my friend Sarah is joining me today from...
Atlanta!
Yay! Hi, Sarah. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
How are you?
I'm doing good. I am a little hyped up on a little too much coffee right now, but that's good.
What kind of coffee?
I got a Mocha this morning, and I have been slowly sipping it throughout my day. And now it's almost 8 p.m. here in Atlanta, and I'm probably not going to go to sleep if I keep drinking it. So I put it at the very far corner of the table so I don't accidentally, instinctively go for it while I am talking to you.
Okay, that's a good idea. Over the course of this episode, I am going to catch up with you on the caffeination. I have my mug of Gentle Sky. That's what the capsule is called. My Gentle Sky coffee. Terrible for the environment. Amazing for...
for you.
I don't know, waking me up in the morning. Yeah, it's like the perfect temperature. You know, that's like the best thing about these machines. They always give you like the perfect temperature coffee. So yeah, I'm gonna catch up.
I look forward to it.
You used to live in Philadelphia, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. My family's ethnically South Asian, and my parents were both born and raised in East Africa. And I was not born in Florida. I was born in Canada, but I grew up in Florida. And so I think I'm made for sipping coconut water on the beach.
That's fabulous.
Or sugarcane juice, you know, or passion fruit juice or something.
I've actually never had sugarcane juice. Is it good?
It's pretty good. I like it a lot. I think if you get fresh pressed sugarcane with a little bit of ginger, it is really good.
Wait, did I have that? Oh, maybe I did. In Morocco once, maybe I actually
yeah,
had
probably.
That. Yeah.
I think they drink that there.
It was pretty good. Yes.
And it's not too sweet, even though it's sugarcane.
Yeah, because it's natural, baby. And so the rest of you, would you like to introduce other things about you?
Sure. So my name is Sarah. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as queer and bisexual. I'm comfortable with both of those labels. Based on who I'm around, it kind of changes.
Yeah.
Ethnically, I'm South Asian, and I was born in Canada. Like I mentioned, my family's from East Africa, and both my parents were born and raised there. When I was growing up, my idea of third culture was that your family has been through 3 different cultures. And so I thought of myself as a third culture kid, and I found out what it actually was.
That's so cute. And also very logical, but right.
So I was like, oh, I'm a third culture kid because we're on our third culture by growing up in North America. And then I realized that no, that's not what it is. And so that's kind of where...
Wow.
But I am still a third culture kid. I'm a queer third culture kid. Just a different kind of third culture. And I've lived mostly across the Eastern Coast. So growing up in Florida, I lived in Philly for 8 years. And now I'm in Atlanta, and I've been here for almost 4 years. Yeah. So East Coast, baby. My parents were both born and raised in different countries of East Africa. And my dad immigrated to New York in the 70s, I believe. My mom immigrated around that time to Canada, which is where I was born. My parents had known each other from back home, but they ended up getting married and all of that post-immigration. And then I was born in Canada, but grew up in Florida, where I spent pretty much my entire childhood between Florida and Canada. Whenever I had a vacation, I would spend it in Canada. And whenever I was in school, I was in Florida. And then I have basically moved up and down the East Coast since I graduated high school.
I think that makes sense then. Why you would think third culture means like I'm at the third culture point in my family's journey.
It was really naive.
I mean, I feel like a lot of expressions are pretty arbitrary, but third culture is kind of an interesting term in itself, I think. I should probably look more into it because I also identify as a third culture kid. But yeah, as kids, you just hear something and your imagination runs with what you understand, right? You have this understanding of your family coming from a different background, your parents' countries of origin, and then like where you were born and then where you lived. And I just love that, actually. That's adorable.
Thank you.
And it would make perfect sense if somebody was using that, you know? And then there would be people who are fourth culture kids and fifth culture kids and 12th culture kids. I think that's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for going along with my childish naivety.
Of course. The way we met was really interesting, right?
Yeah. So I visited Korea earlier this year, and that's where we met.
This
would
year?
you like me to like get a little bit more?
Wait, it was this year? Are you sure? It feels like last year.
It feels like forever ago, but it was February.
I'm sure you're right because you're the one who traveled to Korea. But wow, okay, time is so strange. Anyway, go on.
No, I sat down and I thought about the timeline before we hopped onto the Zoom call because I was like, when did I meet Jay? I know it was February.
Which February?
But I don't remember being able to travel internationally last February. Right. It must have been this February.
Wow.
And then I was like, it was just this February. It's not even been a year.
Wow, it feels a lot longer than that. That's so bizarre, but cool. But anyway, go on. So you were visiting Korea for about like 2 weeks last February, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And our mutual friend, who we didn't know was a mutual friend at this time, added me into a Kakao Talk group where queer people, queer foreigners mostly, or like queer English speakers, because they were like, this is probably the easiest way for you to like connect with people and find things to do, etc., since I'm not fluent in Korean.
Right. This mutual friend we're talking about, they are Korean American. And at the time, you knew them through an Asian queer group in Atlanta, right? Because you're both based in Atlanta. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then through that, that's how I met you, or found stuff to do, and that's how we met.
Yeah.
And then when we were talking, we found out that I have this mutual friend that is also your friend because they used to live in Seoul and now they live in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And you knew them when they lived in Seoul. And that just blew my mind.
Yeah, who used to live in the flat that I was living in at the time, right before they left for Atlanta.
Yeah.
So we were saying, like, it's 60 degrees of separation, it's the expression. But really, like, it's usually more like 1 or 2 degrees of separation.
Yeah, especially in like queer circles, which I'm finding. I'm like, how interconnected is the global queer circle? I didn't expect to be so interconnected.
Yeah.
You know, in Atlanta, if this had happened, it wouldn't have been so weird because we're all so intertwined with each other. Or like, you know, you're only a couple degrees separated from pretty much anyone in Atlanta. Right. Let's be honest. Even though it's a big city. Okay. But you know, like if you're active and you're social and you meet people in like a couple of different groups, it's not that hard to be 3 degrees separated from someone.
Yeah.
And especially if you're queer, 1 or 2 degrees. But the international level, or on an international scale, to be in a country you've never been to before, for the first time, you're just like kind of wandering around, finding your way around. And you're like, oh, let me just plug into the queer community. You never think that you're gonna know any of the same people.
Totally. That's what we were both mutually like marveling at. We're like, the queer community is so everywhere. We will find each other. We're never alone. That's right. Yeah, that's what we were saying. Like, being queer is great in this way. Like, no, as humans, like, it's just nice to meet people who know the people you meet anywhere. But within the queer community, there's this extra level of kinship almost. So it was just like so amazing. Like, both of us were just like, oh my God. And there were like sparkles. I felt like there were sparkles all around us. And it was just like this giddy, like wonderful energy of, oh my God. gosh, let's go get dinner. That wasn't even the plan, but we ended up having a whole meal and like talking about, you know, the places you travel to and like where you're from and our taste in reality TV, sharing that too. Having long discussions about that. Yeah, that was just such a wonderful way to meet someone from across the pond, or is it two different ponds?
I guess it depends on the direction you go.
Yeah, it does. So these days, I'm actually thinking of this term, the queer diaspora. I don't know if it's actually a term, but it's a term that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, we're everywhere and we are connected to each other, not necessarily through blood or religion or ethnicity or nationality, but we are connected throughout queerness, no matter where we are.
Yeah.
You know?
I agree with that. I think that it's so interesting because, like you said, we will find each other. And there have been times where I have connected with people and not even known they were queer, or even when I like didn't even know I was queer.
Yeah.
We've just connected with each other on like such a deep level.
Right.
And then we both realize like, hey, this is something we have in common is our queerness. And we're like, oh, maybe that is what connected us. You know, like that's what was that inciting spark that we saw in each other that like attracted us to even like start talking to each other. I don't know. Like sometimes I feel like it's so hard to tell what has brought you together, but how are most of my friends queer even before I knew I was queer? You know, is like a question that...
Yeah. Oh my God.
I'm like, how did that happen? Like, what was it? I didn't even understand queerness as a concept, like, really deeply or fully. But somehow, majority of my friends ended up queer in some way, whether it was queer in their sexuality, queer in their gender, queer, like, as in genderqueer or trans or whatnot. Like, there's this spectrum of queerness or this matrix of queerness that majority of us have fallen on somewhere. And I don't know how we've all found each other, but we did. Like 80% or maybe 90% now of my friends. I think more so it's the queer community I have now has been more so intentionally built. But the fact that when I was kind of coming into my queerness was also the same time that I realized most of my friends were queer and my friends were coming into their queerness. Like there has to be something about it. Like, please, someone science-y do a study and explain this.
Yeah, I think that would be so awesome because, well, that was my experience in university. I had a group of friends that I was pretty close to. And then, like, after we all graduated, I found out that most of us were queer. And I was like, huh. So we had gone, like, the entire time we're at uni together not really knowing that the other people were queer. But it wasn't even a surprise when we found out. We're like, oh, you too. Okay. And then I heard from at least 2 other people that I know just went, yeah, apparently all my friends were queer and I was the last one to know about it. Queer people will find each other. That's what the point is.
Yes.
Yes.
More and more, I feel like everyone is queer.
Yeah.
And so more I go on in life, I'm like, maybe you're just repressing it really strongly. But like most people, like I feel like 90% of the world is actually queer.
Yes.
On some level,
and
like some way.
Right, exactly.
Because queerness is like, it's like a spectrum or a matrix or something. Like
it's a huge spectrum. Yeah.
And so it makes sense to me that majority of people would be somewhere on this spectrum. Like you wouldn't fall neatly into like one box or the other. And for me, the way I understand queerness is it's not a box the same way that heteronormativity is. And so there is that freedom of finding your place on the spectrum of queerness.
Yeah.
And so I'm like going through the world and I'm convinced like 90% of people are queer and maybe half of them just don't know it yet. And like maybe another portion of that are really trying to repress it. But we're all here. Like, we're here. I'm pretty sure we're all queer.
Yeah, if cis-het normativity is a box, which I do think that it is, it's a very rigid one at that. Because everything outside of that box is queer, right?
Yeah.
So there's just, logically, there's just more space for somebody to be queer than not. And mainstream society has set up really, really good reasons for you to want to stay in that box. But once you, for whatever reason, sometimes it's a choice to explore and sometimes it's not. For whatever reason, once you choose to step out of that box, or some people are just never in that box, but once you do, then there are a billion endless ways to be queer. So I think it's about, I was having this conversation with another friend and we were talking about how there's no such thing as the queer agenda, the gay agenda. The agenda for us is for everybody to feel free to be who they are, like truly. And we don't really care if that comes with the label of queer or not. But I think in this context of our conversation, I think, seeing it in this light, like queerness is just giving yourself permission to be free and explore yourself without feeling the need to be in this box. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does. I think there's a vastness to queerness, like you're saying, that doesn't exist in heteronormativity.
Yeah.
And there's like a comfort in heteronormativity because of the way society is structured. But I think society is structured to strip things of nuance in general, not just with gender and sexuality. And I think like entering my 30s now, I feel like I have a little bit better perspective on nuance in general. I think in my 20s and like early 20s and in my late teens, things were pretty black and white, like right and wrong kind of a thing. And like now when I look at the world, I see certain things with a little bit more nuance, like not, and this isn't talking about queerness or gender, but just like certain structures or systems that are in place in different governments, for example, or like certain laws that might be in place, or like the way things are set up. There is like things sometimes make sense, but then you look at the nuance or like the implications of certain things and you're like, hey, it's not that cut and dry. It's not that black and white. Like here in Atlanta, there's a huge movement called Stop Cop City because they're tearing down a huge swath of the forest that's here in Atlanta to build a militarized police training facility. And the argument is that it's going to make residents safer and that there will also be some training for the fire department and that it's going to be good for the city. And like, if you were to just look at that argument and take it at face value, you might agree with that. But then when you look at like the racial makeup of Atlanta and the structures of racism in the United States in general, and think about like the level of police violence that has been enacted on residents here, you're like, hey, it's not that cut and dry. There's like a lot more to this. And this is probably actually not good for majority of the people living here. It might be great for the police, but it's not really good for most of us. Once you start like peeling back layers and looking at it and like not just taking the structure for its word. And so I think there's so many systems like that are just like, we'll make the decision, you just fit yourself into the box. And queerness kind of pulls you out of that and it makes you start questioning other structures too. I mean, of course, not every queer person is going to challenge other structures just because they're challenging structures of heteronormativity, but I think that there is a reason that so many queer people think or challenge these other structures, and it's because we've already had to challenge the structure of heteronormativity.
Yes.
And cis heteronormativity specifically.
Yes. Every time we have spoken together, I feel like mentally we are really like vibing at a similar frequency. Yeah. And I feel like the expressions that you're using are exactly what I want to say about a certain topic, but sometimes it doesn't come out of my brain. It just comes out of your brain. It's a wonderful experience. I want to acknowledge that.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm in my 7th month of testosterone, gender-affirming hormonal therapy. And I think it's definitely doing something to my brain in a way where, everybody describes it as a second puberty. I think that's totally, totally accurate because I need to sleep more, I need to eat more, but I also feel a little stupider temporarily. Like a teenager is not a lot of teenagers, not all of them, but teenage years can be where you feel kind of ineloquent. Because your body's going through so many changes and it needs energy elsewhere. And I feel like I used to be better with my words than I currently am.
That is so fair.
a lot of my energy
Yeah.
is just going to, I don't know, growing muscles or something. And I find myself struggling to find like the right fancy words these days. But since I can't really do that, apparently, for now, I love it when people are like, oh, just to build on your point, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that's exactly what I wanted to hear and say. And just, I feel so seen and validated. I feel like it's like an extra limb I need in my life to do this mental graspings for me. So thank you for doing that.
Of course. I feel like our conversations just flow so easily.
They do.
And it feels so like, I don't know, so natural that I feel like I'm not even thinking that hard about it.
Yes.
Which is really nice. And as for your like hormone therapy and being on testosterone, I feel like when you're on T and when you're on T for like the first year or even 2 years, from what I understand from my friends who have been on it, like your body is putting so much energy into like dealing with the changes that are happening to it and like understanding like what is going on, because now you have like a completely different level of testosterone or of this hormone in your body, you know? So I think, yeah, give yourself some grace. You're doing great.
Thank you. You said earlier that you grew up in Florida and Canada. Your family is also Muslim.
Yes.
So, like, I wonder, because you grew up in the post 9/11 world, in an American world, I was kind of curious about that experience, if you're comfortable sharing that, and, you know, eventually, like, how that links to your experience of queerness, too.
Yeah.
Because it's all interconnected, but I'm sure there are certain elements that were prominent, like when you're growing up,
Yeah.
in terms of religion and, you know, ethnicity and all that stuff, given where you grew up.
Yeah. I think that question touches on a couple of different things for me. So I'll start with the very like easy to answer part about growing up in a post 9/11 society. I was really young when 9/11 happened, but I still remember it. And because I spent the majority of my life growing up in it, I think I spent a really good chunk post 9/11 kind of performing what I thought a good Muslim out in society looked like. And by that, what I mean is, especially after 9/11, a lot of the messaging I got from my community is, you are a Muslim, so you represent all of us. And so you will be judged. If you do something wrong, we will all be judged by your actions. And you will be judged as a Muslim person and not just as an individual, which I think is true for racialized people too, like people of color in the United States. And I think the religion just added on an additional layer to that. So I grew up kind of hyper vigilant of my own behavior and feeling very like I had to be really good. I had to be really well behaved. Of course, coming from an immigrant family, also had to be a really good student, because I feel like every immigrant child, no matter what continent they're from, but especially if they're from Asia or Africa, in my childhood experience, those were the communities that I was like most in touch with. And that's not to say other communities are different, but like all immigrant communities, I feel like are like, you have to be a good student and you have to like do well in school to a certain extent, or you at least have to graduate.
Graduation is a big thing.
You know?
Got that diploma.
Exactly. And so, you know, and for my parents, they took it up a notch and they're like, you better be an honor roll student. You know, you can't just graduate. You gotta be really good. And so I was like, so I have to be this really good student. I have to be really well behaved. I have to kind of keep my head down and not reflect negatively on my community. So I feel like there was so much restriction that was happening that I didn't even realize, because I had internalized so much of this messaging that I had really boxed up parts of myself and my identity that I didn't even know existed because of growing up in this post 9/11 society and having to perform as a good Muslim, basically. And it wasn't until I got to college and really started branching out and being like, I can be annoyed about things and I can be a little bratty and that's okay, you know? I mean, that's not okay to be really bratty to people, but like...
Did you say bratty?
Yeah, like, you know, kind of like snarky maybe is a better word. I can be a little snarky sometimes. I can be a little petty sometimes. Like, it's not good to be that all the time, but sometimes if, you know, someone wants to make a snide comment and I want to like say something back, now I will. Before I wouldn't. So there is that aspect of it that I have had to give myself permission to be human and to have my bad moments and to be able to like stray from the good student, good immigrant girl identity. Good immigrant Muslim girl identity that I think was thrust onto me. And then the other thing that question brought up for me is that, you know, I feel like I was very blessed and lucky to grow up in a Muslim community that was, for example, my first exposure to queerness was through my community. Because I met adults my parents' age who were queer and who were out and who were part of the community, more so in Canada. To be very honest, not really in the States.
The mosque that your mom was a part of, am I right? Back in Canada?
Yes. Back in Canada, and you know,
there were queer members there.
There were queer members, and some of them were people that she immigrated with around that same time, and that, you know, who were related to her friends, and they were all connected from like quote back home, basically, and like we're building this community together. And I don't know if they were open about their queerness back home or not, or if that's something they kind of like hid, or if that's something they figured out post immigration. I wasn't alive, and so I don't really know their story that well. But when I was growing up, they were out, they were queer, and pretty much everyone knew it. And like no one that I interacted with, or at least got my messaging from, ever explicitly said anything negative about that. I think maybe if I was older, I might have heard some stuff, or maybe not. But for me growing up, I saw them as like a part of the community. They volunteered in the community. People looked up to them, or, you know, were shoulder to shoulder doing stuff with them in the community. And they are some of the people who built up that mosque. And, you know, they supported each other. They built up this community of immigrant East Africans who were coming to Canada and who didn't really know each other. Like, they provided each other food. They all helped each other find places to stay, helped each other find jobs. And so in that sense, their queerness was just one aspect of their identity. And I don't think like I had that nuance when I was that young to really understand that necessarily. But what I did understand was they were queer and everybody knew it and everybody still loved them. And so I never got this messaging that it was wrong or bad from that community. I think from the outside world, yes. And I think that there were people in the communities who were particularly homophobic, but they felt like outliers, or they didn't feel like representative of the whole. And so I feel very blessed to have grown up in that specific Muslim community where it was just part of it. These members' sexuality was just part of who they were, and not something that ostracized them.
That's so awesome to hear. I remember when we had talked about this before, you told me some stories about like people from the communities that your parents were a part of, and I just remember being amazed and really like delighted to hear those stories, because like I grew up in a Christian church community in Korea before I moved to the UK, and I can't imagine really anybody being that open and it being so openly accepted. And one of the things that I really felt was so great about your experience was that a lot of queer people I meet in Korea, no matter where they're from originally, I think a lot of the members of the queer community have so much religious trauma and, you know, that sense of persecution, isolation, like really exclusion and punishment, that just the concept of religion becomes kind of almost reduced to something that's just very negative. And my experience in the church that I grew up in was a mixed bag. You know, it wasn't all negative, but it wasn't all positive. I definitely felt like we couldn't talk about certain things. But I found that sense of community. I found that network of people who were kind of there, you know, didn't matter what kind of person I was. They all knew me. And I don't know, like when I was spending time in the UK and like coming back and forth between the church in Korea, like during my summer breaks, kind of like you, how you would go to Canada during your summer breaks. I would come over here to Korea on my summer breaks in the UK. And it just gave me such a great sense of comfort that there were all these people who had known me since I was a child and knew who I was, not as a foreigner, but like as somebody who belonged in this country, in this world. So I just really appreciated that. And I have a lot of people in my life now, including my family members, who are part of the church. And it's not like a monolith, like Christians are not a monolith at all. But because I love them and I appreciate them and I appreciate their faith and I respect their faith and what it means to them, it makes me kind of sad sometimes when people just cast religion in a very simple, like stark negative, no, religion's bad sort of perspective. Because like we were saying earlier, there's nuance. So it was just really, it made me so happy. By the way, I'm very neutral on religion. I have certain opinions about certain things about religion, but on religion itself, I just don't really think I have a position. So it just made me feel happy to hear that, you know, you had these experiences. And yeah, like who would have imagined, right? Like if you don't know anybody, if you don't hear stories like this, it's really hard to imagine that, like, oh, right, so Sarah, growing up as a Muslim American, her first exposure to queerness was through her religious community. You know, that's not something that's like in the popular imagination, I think.
Yeah.
So it's friggin' awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, like I said, I feel very blessed. I know that's not a lot of people's experiences. And the fact that it was my experience sometimes feels like an anomaly. But I also realized that it was probably also similar for certain other people who were growing up in the same mosque and who were seeing this too. So there is that. I think that religion can either be a really positive force or people can manipulate it and use it as a tool to ostracize others. But I think if you look at what a lot of major religions really are at their core, their whole idea is to bring people together and to be like, you should be a good person and you should take care of your community. And it doesn't always end up that way because I think humans like to divide themselves and find reasons to like oppress each other or like subjugate each other. And religion ends up often being used
for that
as like kind of like that scapegoat. Yeah, but it can also provide people so much comfort or like hope and guidance. And I think your values can come from religion, but also your values can be reflected back into the religion in the sense that if people want to find a reasoning to hurt another person, they can twist their religious beliefs to fit that. Or if you want to find a reason to like say, hey, you're wrong, I'm right, and then you can like cherry pick something from like your religion. And I think people do that pretty often, unfortunately. So it makes me sad that people have a lot of negative experiences with religion and a lot of people have religious trauma because living in this world can already be so traumatic. We don't need another form of trauma.
Yes.
And so I feel really sad and I also feel so lucky at the same time.
Yeah. If people want to take that stance of wanting to hurt others because they are different from them, or we perceive somebody as being so different from us that we can't imagine a world where they're right and we're both like valid in our differences, then you can choose anything. You can pick anything to hurt them with, right? It doesn't have to be religion. But because religion has such a stronghold in the mainstream society, a lot of the times, religion is easy to pick because there's already a bunch of people who agree with you on something. And it's just so easy to get into that group mentality, that whole like in-group, out-group mentality specifically. And say like, if you're not exactly how we define our community, then, you know, you're out. And it seems to gel people together and make you feel safer. And I often think that's kind of an illusion. But I was actually thinking about this because I know like Christians in my life who go to a very inclusive church, who advocate for the queer community, and the need for them to be included. And then I know Christians in my life who still kind of believe that homosexuality is wrong just because the Bible says so. But if they actually met a queer person in their life, they know me.
Right.
Maybe they don't know that I'm queer, but they would never be unkind, like they would never actually say like, you're going to go to hell. They might say, I'll pray for you. But like, I know that they will treat me with their version of love. Like the last time I was at my family gathering on my mom's side, like everybody's like a pastor, like everybody's super involved in their respective churches. And my uncle, who's a pastor, asked me, so like, are you going to church these days? And I was like, no, I haven't gone to a church in like, I don't know, the last 20 years. At least not really voluntarily. It was more like a family function thing if I did go. But he asked me, oh, why don't you go? And I told him because I feel like the churches I grew up in, the messaging I got was that the church is supposed to be a safe place and God is like all loving, all forgiving, like whatever. And Jesus was all about, loving your neighbor. And as I grew up, I came to understand that the church doesn't actually embrace all people, especially in Korea. Even the church community I grew up with, I felt like some people are made to feel unsafe and not good about themselves because they belong to the church. And I can't really make sense of that. So that's why I don't go. And then he looked very thoughtful and he kind of just nodded and said, yeah. And I was like, yeah. And then we had some food and then we said goodbye. But that's the kind of nuance, right? That we're talking about. I don't know. I've just never been around people who are so black and white about stuff in my personal life that, I don't know. I just feel like, there are these experiences too.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I feel like the folks who are very black and white, a lot of times, sometimes things can be very clear cut for a person. I'm not trying to deny that. But for some people who are just so like, this is so black and white, like this is how I was taught, it's black and white, there's no nuance, nothing. Sometimes that comes off to me as indoctrination and not religion. You know what I mean?
Yes. There's definitely a difference. Yeah. Because
I feel like for religion, you have to question things to understand it. And religion, if you're gonna lead your life based on religious principles, you have to be able to understand them. And if you don't question anything, if you don't dig deeper, do you really understand it or are you indoctrinated? That's kind of the perspective that I have right now. I mean, it may change. I may have more nuance in the future or something, but
sure.
Based on what I have seen and experienced in my life from people, a lot of people who I've interacted with who see it very black and white, once you start questioning things, they just start falling apart. They don't know how to respond to it because they themselves have never questioned this. So...
Right.
I think that's something when you were talking about the people who see it so black and white and not really interacting with them. I feel like I don't interact with them. Most of the people I interact with who are religious to some level aren't also seeing it black and white. And I think it's because they've taken the time to question certain things.
Right.
Or to like hear other people out or hear other perspectives out, even if they don't necessarily agree with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the people I've met who see things very black and white have not taken that time out. And I feel like, do you believe this because you think you're supposed to? Or do you really like believe it because it calls to you? And if it calls to you, what parts of it do, what parts of it don't? Why does it? Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah.
I was just going to say also, I think it's really amazing that you did talk to your uncle so frankly about the church and what you've seen or what you've observed and experienced, and to have him accept that feedback, even if he didn't have a response for it in the moment. I think that that's amazing. And it's not an easy thing to do with your own family, I feel like. And I hope that maybe since he's a pastor, he takes that idea or like that plants a seed in him. And he's like, maybe this changes how I approach my church community or like the way I message around certain things. And I think that that's really amazing. I think that takes a level of strength and confidence. It's always really difficult to, put your perspective on religion into words because it can be such a personal or internal thing.
Absolutely.
And then to like share that feels particularly vulnerable.
You can definitely feel like that. And I think in a similar way to you, maybe, I feel kind of lucky to have, on my mom's side anyway, the brand of like faith that they naturally lean more towards is like more progressive, slightly more independent, little small churches rather than big mega churches and more dogma-oriented approaches. I don't think they're really into that. So like the kind of church that my uncle leads, they have like group therapy sessions that go with like prayer sessions, and they do like in-depth Bible studies, I've heard, and they do meditations together, and it's quite an interesting, there's a whole like branch of Christianity that is a bit more experimental and veers away from like the scary, almost alt-right brand of Christianity we see that is like very powerful homophobic force in Korea that some people link Christianity to sometimes, especially in Korea. I'm not super close to my mom's side of the family. I just know these things about them. So maybe that's why I felt more comfortable sharing it. But it was still quite a nice response to get for him to just take that in rather than reacting or responding directly with something he clearly hadn't formulated any thoughts around. At least that's how it seemed in the moment. So I appreciate it when people just are, okay, all right, that's your thought. Let me just take that in. We don't have to have a response for everything.
Yeah.
That was nice.
I wish that you could tattoo that on so many people's foreheads. I think that so many people, not even just in the religious community, but like just so many people in the world
in general,
need to like read that, absorb it, and then see it every time they look in the mirror, because I agree. You
so
do not
it like backwards.
Yeah. It's like you do not have to have a response for everything every single time.
I agree with that.
Like, it's okay to sit with stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like a lot of the mainstream culture would say that, especially I think in the West, what I've observed growing up in the UK is like you need to have your argument ready. You need to get into debate. Debates are seen as a good thing, which can be really healthy. But also, like, I think on some level, it gives you the sense that if you don't have a comeback for whatever the other person is saying, that just means that you're stupid or that you're just lacking in some way. You're showing vulnerability. And that's just not true. The whole point of conversations and debate is to learn and to grow, and it's not to win, usually. It's just to, like, communicate, right? Communication is just communicating. Sometimes part of communicating is not talking.
Right. It's like listening and absorbing what's being said.
Exactly. Listening. Listening is part of communication. But we don't really teach people how to listen. How do you do that?
Yeah. No, we don't.
We don't.
We don't teach people how to listen. And I think there's a difference between hearing someone and like really listening, you know, like deep listening.
Yeah.
And like sometimes people only like hear enough so that they can like combat or like formulate a comeback, like you're saying, to that person instead of like understanding where they're coming from.
Exactly.
And I think as much as this sucks, but like I think sometimes you have to like feel safe or like feel like you're in a safe space to listen, because I think sometimes people feel like if they don't have that immediate response, they're gonna be judged and they're gonna like lose points or lose face or something. Yeah. But I think another thing that what you were saying brought up is if you're like trying to defend a certain point, for example, and you're more closely tied to that point. So if I'm sticking with religion, if I'm trying to defend my religious experiences and say like it wasn't a bad thing or religion hasn't been a bad influence, and then someone who may feel very unconnected to that topic or maybe just arguing for argument's sake, you know, they might be able to argue in a clearer way because I'm emotionally connected to my experience and to this part of how I was raised and how I grew up. And so I am also having an emotional reaction while having to like try to logically respond. And then I feel like people who have reactions like that, like whenever I've had an emotional reaction and had trouble defending my point, I guess you could say, I've been berated for it further. And so that doesn't really induce listening on either of our sides because I don't really want to hear what this other person who's berating me and my experiences really has to say about anything. Because it feels like they're just trying to argue with me to argue or push my buttons or whatever. And I feel like for other people too, when they're emotionally connected to a topic, like everything is heightened and everything feels higher stakes. And so I think when you feel safer, people actually listen more then. And that's wild to me because part of debating effectively, from what I learned when I was in debate in high school, is hearing the other person's argument and like understanding it so that you can analyze it and respond to it. Yes. And that's what debate is. It's like a response. Like you have these viewpoints that you're responding to, you know, and like they teach you, like, for example, logical fallacies. You're building up a straw man and stuff, and like to identify that. But then you start debating this straw man if you're not like listening properly. But if you say, hey, I see what you're doing, I hear what you're saying, you're taking us away from the topic. Let's go back here. That's part of like one of those benefits that listening provides when you're, quote, debating. So listening is such an important skill, and it's just not ingrained enough, especially, I agree, in Western societies.
Yeah, that's the wild thing to me too. I think almost everybody wants to be heard, but most of us don't know how to hear other people. So, like you said, it just doesn't lead to an effective communication. And I think there are different types of conversations too. There are more intellectual discussions. You can totally have theoretical discussions or more logical discussions that's about logic.
Like what makes sense the most? Yeah, practical.
And then there are conversations where the point is about emotional sharing and emotional validation. And a lot of the times when we're sharing personal stories, I think usually what people are looking for is validation, and it is more emotionally centered. And I think sometimes it's easy to get used to one type of conversation and miss the fact that maybe the person you're speaking to is just looking at the conversation from a totally different perspective. And then there's that breakdown in what you're trying to do and how the other person is engaging in the conversation. Like with your example of maybe one person is coming more from an emotional space, but the other person just doesn't get that or doesn't care, or like vice versa, you know? It's such a simple thing to make people feel comfortable, which is to just let them communicate their perspective without putting your own filter on it, or at least try not to. But that's a hard skill to learn too. I'm learning.
No, for sure. It is hard, because if you grow up in an individualistic society, you're kind of taught to center yourself and your perspective in some ways. Yes. And so then sometimes the only way you can understand another person's perspective is by attaching it to your experiences. And sometimes it doesn't translate well, you know?
Yeah, totally.
So I totally get that. I have to sit with this and think about this more, because I feel like this is bringing up so many like fragments of thoughts that I'm like, oh man, I want to like tease this out a little bit more. But yeah, I agree.
Please do that. And then we can totally have a whole, you know, next conversation about that. Because, yeah, it's just such an interesting and important topic that, again, I don't think is dealt with a lot of nuance a lot of the times. Maybe people just don't have space and time to do it. But I think we can make space and time to do that.
I would love that too.
Can I just quickly go back to what you said about growing up as a Muslim person in the American society post 9/11? I remember you were sharing this story with me last time we spoke as well. And I think what really jumps out at me from that story, again, this is from my perspective, it's just that burden, especially as a child growing up, that idea of like having to really be this model minority, basically. Having all of that weight on you, I think is a lot. And I remember you were saying this to me when you were like in high school, maybe like middle and high school. You had this idea that if you had a crush on someone, you thought that they wouldn't want to date you because you're Muslim.
Yes, I forgot I said that, but yes, that is very, very real and very, very true.
Right. And that to me is like really heartbreaking, you know? Like, I don't think any child should grow up believing those things about themselves. So when you said that you felt that pressure from the Muslim community, I wonder how much of that was coming from the Muslim community and how much of that was coming from the rest of society. Because the Muslim community is not really putting that on themselves for no reason.
Yeah, I think the crush part is something I felt from the world at large, but the pressure to perform is something that I felt from my community. I think growing up post 9/11 means that I grew up like at the height of like, quote, the war on terror. And there were just so many bad faith takes on what Islam is and what Muslims are like. And I think some of these stereotypes really persist today, not just in the United States, but in like a lot of other places that don't have a lot of Muslims or exposure to Muslims. And
yeah, in Korea, for example.
Yeah, I didn't want to say it, but I have heard some people say certain things like from Korea or in Korean media, and I've just been like, hey, like that's totally not true, or that's totally not my experience. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't think there's a very large Muslim population in Korea for people to have that experience or know any better. And not just Korea, like in many other countries too, that I've like seen media come out of that has like not always portrayed Muslims in the best light. I'm like, where did this come from? Like, you don't even have a lot of Muslims in your country if you look at the demographic breakdown.
That's so true. The ignorance.
Yeah. And I think people have these really ingrained ideas of Islam that a lot of them now come from this post 9/11 society. I think in the United States historically, there's been a long history of Muslims in the United States. Some of the first people who came to the United States as people who were enslaved were Muslim.
Right.
A lot of members of the Black Panther Party had ties to the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was Muslim and is one of the most like well-known Muslim Americans. Muhammad Ali, one of the most well-known Muslim Americans. And, you know, that was still looked upon negatively, I think, a lot by a wider American public. And I think that, you know, especially post 9/11, you have this whole idea of the terrorist Muslim, the other very conservative stereotype. And there wasn't, when I was growing up and still in middle school and in high school, a lot of active challenging to a lot of these stereotypes. And so, yeah, I felt like a lot of the messaging that people had gotten from the larger society was that Muslims are very backwards and ignorant. You know, there's a very common stereotype that Muslims are very homophobic, or that we don't mesh well with, quote, Western society, whatever that means. So, yeah, I did have this like assumption or this like kind of fear that, you know, if I liked someone, they would already have all these preconceived notions of me and my values and what I believed in just because they would see that tag of me being Muslim. And it came from like the jokes that other kids would make about religion and Islam. And like, even if it wasn't like necessarily targeting me or like in a bullying way, but just casually. And so, you know, I knew that even if they didn't say that they really believed that, like they had gotten it from somewhere, right? And so, yeah, it would make things nerve-wracking for me because I'd be like, wow, like this person probably already has this impression of me based on my religion, and they wouldn't even want to date me because they'd probably be like, what does she have to offer? You know, she comes from like this backwards community or whatever. And now that I'm older and have a lot more perspective on it, I can see how that was just not true. And even if it was true, that didn't need to stop me. If that is someone's ignorance, that's on them, and that's not my burden to carry. But that only comes with a little bit of hindsight and a little bit more life experiences, I think.
Completely.
Or at least for me, that's what it has come with.
Oh yeah, I can see how that would be the case. Wow, that's like very upsetting to hear. I mean, it's true, right? It's not on you. It was never, I don't know. It's these stories of childhoods that really get to me for some reason. It's because you're so young. Like, I think anybody with a shitty childhood, whatever made their childhood bad, can maybe relate to it on a certain level. But I mean, this is really something that, like, I can relate to the experience of being racialized. You don't maybe understand it at the time because you're so young, but being that weird representation, that pressure to be the representation of your people is an like nonsensical thing for a child to have to carry around in the first place. But also, if you come from an immigrant family as well, and you're part of a certain religious community, whatever it is, but in your case, it was such a specific time in the society that you grew up in. And to have those kids make those jokes, like, to them, I feel like it's nothing. When you're the one who are making the jokes, it really doesn't have a lot of impact. You can't do it without intending to hurt anybody or really giving it a second thought. It's just something you can do. And you are not the one who has to think about how that impacts somebody in the same room as you. And I think that gap is really painful to think about, you know, and I'm not trying to like speak for you or on your experience. I'm just, this is like,
Yeah, no, I understand kind of what you're saying, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And, I had another Muslim American friend who shared one anecdote with me about something that happened to her in a classroom as well. And again, that like little thing, nobody was like physically harmed, but the fact that she remembers it really clearly and, you never forget these things. And when it's tied to such a political and something on such a larger scale than you, like I feel like it can make you feel super powerless. And I'm really glad that you have come to this understanding now that the burden isn't on you. Like you're clearly an amazing person.
Oh, thank you.
That you can even speak about this too, like in this way. But still, it just sucks.
Yeah, it does. And I think part of my like understanding of it, or like my coming to peace with it, is that I also have the perspective and the hindsight now to know that a lot of the stuff wasn't coming from a malicious place. And also understanding that I myself growing up, like I'm sure I have said ignorant things, not maybe about religion, but I'm sure about other things. Like when you're young, you kind of only know what the world is telling you until you know better.
Until you peel back the layers.
Exactly. Until you peel back the layers.
And step out of the box.
And so, I'm sure that I have also internalized or repeated ignorant things in my childhood that I may not remember, but that somebody else might remember hearing from me. And if anybody has, I apologize profusely for it. But I understand that a lot of these were not coming from a malicious place or like with the intent to hurt. Versus I had kids that I grew up with who went to my mosque who did have experiences where people were actively bullying them and were doing that maliciously, not just purely out of ignorance, like not making like these passive aggressive comments or something out of ignorance or making these jokes out of ignorance, but with the intent to like bully them. And so I think that for me, when I look back on this, I'm kind of able to give those kids some grace and to give myself some grace and be like, like these weren't coming from malicious places. These were coming from ignorance. And like, that is very different. And I think had it been in university or, in our 20s or something and people were still making comments like that, I would probably still hold it against them because I can be petty sometimes. And I wouldn't probably give them the same amount of grace because I'm like, okay, you should be able to peel back the layers now. You should be able to think about things a little critically now. But when we're so young and we're internalizing a lot of these messages that are being told to us, and there's so much going on when you're young and you're hitting puberty and you're like going through all these changes and you're going through school and everything, you're not going to sit down and peel back the layers of all these different things to that extent. You might start.
No, you're growing layers.
Exactly. You might start, but you're still growing in so many ways. And so I'm like, okay, for me, I'm like, I can give that grace and come to terms with it. And that really helps.
I think you're a very empathetic person.
Oh, thank you.
And you do have a lot of grace. Maybe I'm just petty all the time, but I am amazed when people can be, things happen and, like it's okay. You didn't really mean anything by it. I'm not used to that. I'm not used to people being graceful. Graceful as in, showing grace to other people's shortcomings or mistakes because you actually understand that people make mistakes and you just have that space to show grace to other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I can be very petty also when I'm driving. Driving in Atlanta feels like an extreme sport. And so when someone cuts me off, I'm like hand on horn, like honking, like I don't care, like I know it doesn't do anything, but it releases some anger of like being cut off without like an indication. I'm like, ugh. Honk, and so like
no, that's the worst. It's there for a reason. Unless you're unable to reach it, like I don't care what the reason is. It's like basic decency.
Yeah. Exactly.
I just appreciate people being forgiving for the little things, but for the other experiences that you had, I'm still holding on to grudges. And
I mean, I have other grudges.
Right.
I'm no saint. I I have my other grudges that I will hold on to for the rest of my life, and I will take to the grave. And if God exists and holds me accountable for them, I will be like, no, I have nursed these grudges my whole life. Like, I cannot let go.
That's where we'll actually get into a debate with God about how justifiable it is. I'm talking specifically about similar instances that were made about, racial jokes and very sexist jokes that kids would tell. I still hold grudges because I was the same age as them, and I'm pretty sure I didn't make any jokes. Part of it was because I wasn't comfortable speaking in English, but those instances, I'm trying to work them out. But hearing you talk about it is quite helpful as well, because I'm not in that place. But I totally see what you're saying, and it's just helpful to hear somebody who has a slightly different take on it. So when you were a kid, you had this idea, being restricted in terms of maybe dating people because of certain parts of your identity or identifier that was put on you. Oh, and I remember you telling me also during that time, you would have crushes on people other than cis guys, but you had trouble identifying those as crushes because you just didn't really know about queerness, or didn't have the concept of queerness in the same way that you would later on have in college.
Yeah.
I really vibe with that too. I was like, yeah, I totally know what you mean. I did not know that this feeling I had in 5th grade toward my 짝꿍, which means my partner, which means the person sharing my desk, who's actually a Korean person from the States, was a crush. I didn't know that. So, what happened in college?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Is my question.
So
my conversation with Sarah will continue in next week's episode. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Sarah and or have stories of your own, either of growing up in the religious community as a queer person or growing up third culture or both, please feel free to share them with us. You can DM us on Instagram. Our handle is at @the_coffeeshop_AU, or you can email us. Our address is hi@thecoffeeshopau.com. Both recorded voice notes and written messages are welcome. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will meet you back here next week. Take care.